Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami, and all of us at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Michael J. Bustamante to discuss Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile. To introduce tonight's speaker and moderate the conversation with him, we're joined by Dr. Jorge Duany. Dr. Duany is the director of the Cuban Research Institute and professor of anthropology at Florida International University. Dr. Duany has published extensively on Caribbean migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 22 books, including Picturing Cuba, Art, Culture, and Identity, On the Island and in the Diaspora, and Puerto Rico, What Everyone Needs to Know. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Cuban Memory Wars from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. Thanks for supporting your locally owned independent bookstore. And in case you didn't catch the very start, because I think this clicked in, I want to thank the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University and the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami for collaborating with us on this event. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Duany to the stage. Hello.
Thank you, Cristina, and good evening, everyone. As usual, we're very grateful to Books and Books for helping us to showcase the best work in Cuban and Cuban American studies, and now virtually, but hopefully we can continue sometime soon to do this face-to-face. I'm also happy to acknowledge the collaboration and co-sponsorship of tonight's event by our colleagues at the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami Library. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Michael J. Bustamante, who is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Florida International University, where he specializes in modern Cuba, Cuban America, and the Caribbean. He also teaches courses on Latin American, Latino, and Latina, Caribbean, and U.S. histories, including a course on Cuba since 1959, a seminar on the Cuban Revolution, and an introduction to Latinx history. And perhaps on another occasion, we could talk about the term Latinx, but not tonight. Michael Bustamante is also a very active and dynamic faculty affiliate of the Cuban Research Institute. He completed his PhD in Latin American and Caribbean history at Yale University, where he also earned an MA and an MPhil in history, as well as a BA summa cum laude in History and International Studies from Yale. He is the co-editor of the well-regarded volume, The Revolution from Within, Cuba 1959 to 1980, which we actually presented with Books and Books some time ago. His scholarly writings have appeared in numerous journals, including the Journal of American Ethnic History, Cuban Studies, Latino Studies, Hispanic American Historical Review, Perspectives on History, and the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History, among many other venues. He has also received academic grants and fellowships from the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale, as well as the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kemp Memorial Fund, the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami Libraries, and the Social Science Research Council. In 2009, he joined the very prestigious editorial board of the academic journal Cuban Studies. His commentary on contemporary Cuban and Cuban American affairs has appeared in numerous publications like Foreign Affairs, NACLA Report on the Americas, and the Washington Post. He's also been featured in media outlets like NPR, the BBC, the New York Times, and the Associated Press. His writings in Spanish have appeared in Cuban publications such as Temas, Espacio Laical, and Cuba Posible. He's also lectured widely on Cuban and Cuban American topics throughout the United States, Cuba, Europe, and Latin American countries. I now give you, with a lot of pleasure, my colleague and friend, Dr. Michael Bustamante.
Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with you all. I want to thank, first and foremost, my dear colleague, Jorge Duany, and the entire staff of the Cuban Research Institute for not just sponsoring tonight's event, but their unflagging encouragement and support since I joined FIU 5 years ago. I feel very fortunate to be part of the CRI community. I also want to thank my colleagues in the FIU History Department for their support as well in helping me get to the publication of this book. I also have to thank Elizabeth Cerejillo and the entire staff at the Cuban Heritage Collection, past and present, not just, again, for co-sponsoring tonight's event, but for their support over the years. Without their support, much of the research for this book would have been impossible. And finally, thank you so much to Books and Books for facilitating and also co-sponsoring tonight's event. It's great to see the store maintain such an active program, notwithstanding these complicated virtual times that we're living in. So let me first share my screen, that ritual moment in every online presentation. I hope, Christina, that you all are seeing that. Please tell me if you're not. But I want to start. Great, thank you, Christina. I want to start by actually reading a couple of paragraphs from the opening of the book. There are two widely familiar versions of the Cuban story. According to the first, on January 1st, 1959, a ragtag band of rebels swept down from the Sierra Maestra, delivering Cuba from the clutches of short-term dictatorship and longer neocolonial submission to the United States. In this view, the quote-unquote triumph of the Cuban Revolution marked the definitive end of one period of the island's history, nearly 6 decades of pseudo-republican scandal following the island's mortgaged independence in 1902, and the purported beginning of true liberty under the banner of revolutionary change. The second version of the saga accepts its rival's chronological pivot point, but it inverts the order of praise. In the alternate tale, the Cuban Revolution represented not a fulfillment of nationalist dreams, but an unmitigated tragedy. For many of those who left the island in the 1960s, Cuba's turn to socialism made the pre-revolutionary period look like paradise lost, transforming their homeland into an island in chains. In Havana, Miami, and the many coordinates of Cuba's far-flung diaspora around the globe, these dueling master narratives are still routinely on display. More than 60 years after Fidel Castro's rise to power, and more than 4 since his death, diametrically opposed accounts of Cuba's past continue to square off in competing public spaces, museums, and now even social media campaigns. But dig beneath either iteration of the tale, and less streamlined or comfortable narratives of Cuba's history emerge. In reality, Cubans' arguments about their past and the ways they have related to that past since 1959 have never been so straightforward or stable. It may be tempting to reduce Cubans' battles over their history to a metaphorical standoff between one set of voices shouting from Revolution Square in Havana and another positioned atop Miami's literal and figurative Freedom Tower. But if popular visions of the Cuban Revolution's legacies today seem polarized, that polarization conceals more nuanced viewpoints, and it is the result of political and cultural processes that were and continue to be anything but neat. So begins the book, setting the stage, I hope, for all that follows. In 200-some pages and 6 chapters, Cuban Memory Wars endeavors to tell the history, or perhaps I should say a history, of Cubans' mobilizations of, reckonings with, and debates over their past during the Cuban Revolution's crucial first 20 years in power. I've long been fascinated by the prominent place that competing understandings of the island's history occupy in Cuban political cultures. So this book, in essence, attempts to elucidate the longer trajectory of such disagreements. And it reveals that Cubans' competing selective remembrances, to borrow a phrase from the historian Steve Stern, have neither been static nor strictly cyclical over time. Put simply, I argue that prominent struggles over history and memory within, between, and beyond the cities of Havana and Miami didn't just fuel enduring contests over what it meant to be Cuban. They were central to the course of Cuban history itself. One only has to look to the first months following Fidel Castro's rise to power to see how history and memory emerged as prominent battlegrounds and languages on and through which revolutionary officials, cultural producers, and diverse political actors endeavored to invest Cuban citizens in particular and often diverse understandings of the revolution's origins and purpose as a national quest. Disagreements, however, over precisely how and why the revolution came to be, which factions should shape its future and under what ideological vision, and ultimately whether its promises were fulfilled, sparked competitions for historical prerogative that really never went away and with which Cubans have been living ever since. So drawing upon rare press, correspondence, visual media, and to a lesser extent oral history, I track such tensions as they developed in Cuba and trailed those Cubans decamping to the United States. As Cubans on the island navigated the promises and perils of a socialist regime, and as those who became disenchanted with the revolutionary government fled into exile, they all regularly reflected upon what had happened, why, and how to further propel, or for some, reverse history's course. Now, this book is certainly not the first to note the salience of the past to Cubans' political presence. Lilian Guerra, one of my mentors, has excavated, quote, how the grand narrative of the emergent Cuban revolutionary state gave mass participation in the revolutionary process meaning, end quote, in the 1960s. And her work on these themes has been absolutely foundational to my understanding of them. Nor am I the first to think about the histories of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban exile community relationally. One would think that it's super common to do that, but often it's not because of disciplinary divides in academia that tend to separate sort of Cuban insular history from Cuban American or Cuban diaspora history. But I highlight the work of Maria de los Angeles Torres here as a pioneer of such work, of thinking about the island and its diaspora together as part of a shared story. And I also highlight her because she was very generously a reader of my manuscript, without whom the book wouldn't exist. But I'd like to think that my book builds on this and other examples of previous scholarship by offering a more textured, culturally inflected, and fine-grained exploration of the politics of the past in an evolving Cuban present and in real time. And it does so not by focusing so much on representations of history strictly in monuments, museums, or public spaces, although those venues are part of the inquiry here, but more on the mundane stages, public and private, where divergent appreciations of and anxieties about the Cuban past were routinely on display. The speeches of political leaders, dueling editorials in the revolutionary and exile press, organizational records, correspondence, and cultural texts like television, cartoons, song, and film. By bringing to bear such a diversity of materials, I hope readers will come to appreciate the breadth of the actors involved in the Cuban memory wars, as well as the multiple ways the specter of the Cuban past, as inspiration, trauma, keenly felt epic, or at a certain point repetitive official script, pervaded so many aspects of post-1959 Cuban and Cuban diasporic life. Now, to begin telling this story, I had to confront a paradox. Namely, why would history matter so much if the Cuban Revolution, as a project devoted to bringing about a utopian future, was so invested in leaving the past behind? And the answer, I concluded, goes beyond the power of short-term contrast. On the one hand, it is true, the image of a shameful, immediate before under the revolution, under the rule, of Fulgencio Batista, reinforced the premise and promise of a revolutionary after. But on the other hand, the victory of diverse revolutionary forces in 1959 channeled much longer held nationalist dreams as well. There's an essay I often turn to by the scholar Damián Fernández, in which he characterizes Cuban history as moving through repeating cycles of desire and disenchantment. Now, that idea may seem too conveniently alliterative or even a tad reductionist, but I think it helps us understand the ways Cuba's history does seem to be chock full of both foundational and then serial what-if moments. What if the United States had not intervened in 1898 in Cuba's wars for independence? What if José Martí hadn't died before that? What if the revolution of 1930 to 1933 had proven more lasting? What if Cuba's so-called democratic spring in the 1940s wasn't marred by corruption? What if Ortodoxo leader Eduardo Chivas hadn't taken his own life? What if Batista himself hadn't staged a coup in the first place in 1952? The point is, by the 1950s, there was a wide strain in Cuban political culture that saw the island's history and destiny as somehow being unfulfilled. And this new revolution taking shape as the chance to end the cycle of serial disappointment once and for all. Put another way, what the Cuban scholar Maria del Pilar Díaz Castañón evocatively calls the ahora sí, or now finally impulse in Cuban political psychology, was on clear display everywhere you looked in 1959 as revolutionary forces took power. Cuba's myth of subjunctive possibility, as she calls it at another point, cried out to be fulfilled. The problem, of course, was that evaluations of the revolution after that point would not only be informed by discussions about and shared understandings of what had preceded it, including legacies of state violence under the Batista government, nor did they revolve simply around how to commemorate heroes of and award credit for victory in the anti-Batista fight, a very complicated set of memory battles in their own right, given the number of factions involved. What happened after the revolution took power almost immediately also rapidly became grist for the retrospective mill. Events subsequent to the quote-unquote triumph, as well as the revolution's broader political, economic, and social results over the short or long term, either provided evidence that el proceso, or the process, was fulfilling its historic mandate, falling short, or worse, betraying its true goals. And of course, just what those true goals were would prove to be another contentious point in retrospective debate, especially in the pages of the Cuban press in 1959 and 1960, and then sort of echoed on in the pages of the exile press. Now, the omnipresence of the past in the case of the Cuban exile community is perhaps more intuitive or easier to understand. Those who found themselves in disagreement with the direction that the revolution took and felt pressured directly and indirectly to flee the country naturally felt a need to articulate or try to articulate some shared understanding of the experiences of uprooting they had endured and some shared understanding of where the revolution had gone wrong. The political identity of the early exile community found an anchor in common experiences and memories of displacement. One thinks of the iconic images of La Pecera at Havana's airport, property and business confiscations, and worse, state violence. And of course, nostalgia for a country left behind, as you can see represented here. The difficulty, though, was that Cuban exiles after 1959 also brought complex political legacies and thought with them to the United States in their own right. And while they shared much in common, most obviously an enmity toward the Castro government, they also found reason to fiercely debate who among them may have been complicit in the nation's predicament and what had led to Fidel Castro's path to victory in the first place. And this was all complicated by the fact that many had been supporters of the revolution itself initially. So longing for a kind of lost Cuba thus provided only a partial salve. And I would just highlight here the at least ostensible contradiction between a cartoon like this, which sort of celebrates an early promising moment of the revolution to then see the revolution sort of be betrayed, and this cartoon, which highlights this idea of a paradise lost. Presumably, if one thought that a revolution was necessary in some kind of way, what existed before was not just a paradise. So that's an interesting tension that one finds in the memory politics of the early exile community. So these then are some of the stories and cultural processes that I endeavor to trace in the book at their origin point in the 1960s, or even in 1959, as you can see here in this comic book that kind of sort of cast revolutionary history as sort of an iconic morality tale, and throughout the decade of the 1960s, but also as these memory wars evolved and trailed Cubans into the revolution's second decade. Just highlight another couple of examples here. I mean, this is a cartoon that when I found it, I jumped out of my seat in Havana's National Library because it's such an interesting reflection on the memory politics sort of in Cuba in 1959. This is a cartoon sort of satirizing folks who kind of come out of the closet, so to speak, in early 1959 to claim that they've been revolutionaries all along. And so it's this sort of critique, this satiric critique of quote unquote revolutionary pretenders who are sort of inventing fake histories for themselves. Or here, an example of the kind of memory disputes that would punctuate the early political life of the exile community, a sarcastic kind of poem in which the speaker or the author notes his surprise at seeing in line at the Cuban Refugee Center to obtain resettlement assistance, somebody who he remembers from back in Cuba, perhaps a year or a couple of years before, having been very pro-government, right? So it's an interesting sort of memory war inside the exile community. To moments like this in Cuba, right after the Bay of Pigs invasion, when literally members of the invading Brigade 2506 were brought before a public audience a televised public audience and interrogated live on television. And what happened was actually very interesting debates about the recent history of the revolution that had just happened. I followed these stories through the late 1960s, as well as even Cuban artists still on the island are looking back with a bit more jaundiced eyes, perhaps on sort of the early years of the revolution, knowing that the utopia that they had once envisioned isn't so around the corner as perhaps they once thought. And as I was saying, I track these struggles too, as they are kind of inherited by a younger generation, a generation in exile that, as represented by these two groups, Abdallah and the folks behind the magazine Arito, that are both in different ways trying to reckon with the legacies that they've inherited and sort of not get trapped in a certain nostalgia, to the way in which, even at the revolution's sort of high point, quote unquote, of socialist achievement in the 1970s, it is as if Cuban media is sort of constantly reliving the history of the revolution as consummated epic, even as other works of art are showing us a bit more of a nuanced perspective, like in this film, this little known film by Humberto Solás, in which the main character has sort of reached a kind of plateau of happiness and is looking back, not just nostalgically, but somewhat of a disappointed way on the revolutionary trajectory that he has lived. So I want to take at least a couple minutes to acknowledge some topical and perhaps thematic limitations to this book. This is probably something that my editor wouldn't want me to do, but given the subject here, right, Cuban memory politics, it's such a expansive subject that I think it's only, or it could be, and I think it's only fair that I acknowledge what are sort of the boundaries around this project that I had to put when a book has to end at a certain point and only has a certain amount of pages, and also some of the kind of thematic choices and challenges that I wrestled with. You know, one thing that I would say off from the get-go is that there is no way in one monograph that I could cover all subjects, events, individuals around which prominent memory battles have revolved over the years. Some I have excluded quite deliberately because they've been covered elsewhere by other scholars. So certainly I think one reading this book will find examples of perhaps parts of the Cuban Memory Wars story that they may know that aren't covered here, but that's strictly, I think, a function of the limitations of space. Another challenge that I want to acknowledge is the difficulty of getting at private perspectives, that is, individual perspectives. It's one thing to kind of tell the story, as I do here, of how the Cuban state, understood in a complex way, not just as a monolithic entity, attempts to kind of construct over time an official history of its own emergence, right? It's another thing to try to get at how individual Cubans sort of related to that narrative, whether they internalized it in whole or in part, or rejected it. Conversely, one can track in the exile press, for example, or among exile political leaders, the way that they are framing an understanding of Cuban history for sort of public consumption. It's another thing to kind of get at how average people on Calle Ocho are interpreting these narratives and how they relate to them. I have to say, I found it easier to get at that bottom-up perspective in the case of the exile community because the archival records that are left to us are comparatively richer. Whereas on the island, getting at sort of unmediated examples of individual citizens' points of view, 50 years ago is a real challenge that I try to contend with in this book. And last, I would, two last things I would say in terms of topical limitations. One is that it's important to acknowledge that in the long sort of sweep of the Cuban Memory Wars, Cubans of color, Cuban women, LGBT Cubans have had to struggle particularly hard to get their own stories to count as sort of history with a capital H, right? There are also ways in which Cuban state or even Cuban diaspora leaders over time can invoke or seek to appropriate Black and women's history in particular ways. But I found that getting at these questions, as important as they are, was beyond the scope of this book, which focuses on contests over the national epic in the years under study. And given the generally and problematically colorblind and gender neutral terms with exceptions in which arguments over that epoch tended to be framed, the absence of greater treatment of these subjects is reflective, sadly, of the terms of debate, of the Cuban memory wars themselves in many ways, and also the archives that they left behind. And the last thing I'll say in terms of a topical limit, and I meant to flash to this slide so you can just see the table of contents, is to say that this is, as I said at the start, a book that focuses really on the first 20 years of the Cuban memory wars. It ends in 1979, and I'll say something in a second about why I chose that moment to end the book. But suffice it to say, the Cuban memory wars were not over in 1979. They are ongoing. But at the end of the day, I had to sort of put some boundaries, chronologically speaking, around this project. But despite these challenges and limitations, I'm proud of what this book covers. I'm proud of what it achieves. Because between 1959 and 1979, I believe I show the past helped Cubans orient themselves amid, but also critically evaluate extraordinary junctures of hope, crisis, and change. And I believe that tracking not just the mirror images of these processes on both sides of the Florida Straits, but in fact the interplay between them, albeit often implicitly, helps to push Cuban history beyond the dualistic visions of that history that we associate with either side of those Florida Straits, exposing the contradictions of and connections between both. And yet, more than just tracking the ins and outs of Cuban retrospective politics or the Cuban memory wars, this book also unavoidably intervenes in the Cuban memory wars in its own right. That is, in historicizing the course of Cubans' debates over and reckonings with their past across the revolution's first 2 decades, I found myself also recovering significant junctures, processes, textures, and statements from Cuban history, or from the memory wars themselves, that have tended to be erased or at least underemphasized in official, quasi-official, or otherwise canonical iterations or accounts of Cuban history subsequently. So I don't dare to predict that this book will enter into feedback loops with contemporary manifestations of the cultural and political processes it describes, above all because it's in English. And I hope that that's a reality that will change someday. But I'd be lying if I said that I didn't harbor some hope of, with this book, also reshaping the contours of Cuban retrospective politics in the present. At the very least, I think this book offers the possibility of an alternative narrative of Cuban history, one in which Cubans' battles over their past since 1959, not just their divergent experiences of it, become part of Cuban historical memory themselves. So I said I was going to say something about why I chose to end this book's inquiry when I did. And that's because in 1979, for the first time since they had left, with some exceptions that I also covered in the book, Cuban exiles were allowed to go back to the island to visit. And 100,000 did so in a year. The result, I argue, was an important memory encounter between Cubans that ironically is scarcely accounted for in history books in its own right. As veritable apparitions from the past, returning exiles disrupted the distortions through which revolutionary discourse had framed the memory of the departed to that point. Yet visitors also encountered a Cuba that had moved on without them in many ways, was more than a black box, and where their nostalgias had little place. That year, I think, therefore brings us full cycle, or to at least one point where I felt it was appropriate to end at least this scholarly investigation. Because after that point, with the outbreak of the Mariel boat lift a year later in 1980, the cycle of exodus and fracture begins again in so many ways. Now, of course, the story of the Cuban memory wars, as I said, doesn't stop in 1979. So in a conclusion to the book, I do attempt to synthetically bring the story up to date. And speaking of the Mariel boat lift, the Mariel boat lift, the memory politics around that event are fascinating and could occupy probably a book in and of themselves. Because in so many ways, as I argue, the Mariel boat lift became an episode that both sides of the Florida Straits would prefer to forget. And yet it's remarkable how so many Cubans also look back on the early 1980s, that is, Cubans who were on the island at the time. It's so shortly after a moment of total crisis. They look back on that period through a prism of socialist nostalgia as a time of relative openness and abundance and a certain critical possibility. But that would all obviously come crashing down by the next decade as Cuba entered its quote unquote special period, which represented a crisis, not just economically or socially or politically, but for the memory armature of the Cuban state like no other, especially as Cuba found itself paradoxically selling the revolution itself as a memory commodity, while at the same time seeking tourist dollars by indulging in nostalgic longing for the 1950s, the same nostalgia that remained a hallmark of the revolution's opponents in Miami. And I love this satire from the Cuban artist José Ángel Toirac of the revolution as sort of timeless history, and now converted into kind of a marketing campaign almost for tourist purposes in the 1990s. I would just highlight this work of art too that I think gets at some of these dynamics. A banner that says, "To the past we will never return," and yet, you know, the sort of the nostalgia for this idea of Cuba as trapped in time, quote unquote, in the 1950s. This is what the Cuban tourist market has been selling, you know, for 30 years at this point. I end the book, though, reflecting on some more contemporary dynamics in the Cuban memory wars, from the effects of the Obama normalization moment on the Cuban memory landscape, which was a time when Cuba's history of all kinds seemed to be at risk of being silenced, and the island's further metamorphosis into a nostalgic theme park, as satirized in this brilliant New Yorker cover, to the refreezing of relations between the United States and Cuba under Donald Trump and its consequent effects. Indeed, for all that, as I argued, the Cuban cultural landscape has produced fascinating, rich, complex ruminations on history and memory in the last 20 years, it's been fascinating to watch a climate of renewed bilateral tension in some ways egg on a revival of the revolutionary memory canon's greatest hits. And I would just cite as an example this screenshot of what became a prominent Cuban government Twitter hashtag campaign, hashtag Tenemos Memoria, or hashtag We Have Memory, in 2019. Which memory, whose memory, one might ask. So let me conclude by how I started, by reading another passage from the book, if you'll allow me, from a section that I call Forever Memory Wars. The Cuban Revolution came to power in 1959 as a broad political front, uniting Cubans of diverse backgrounds and political persuasions around an overwhelming push for change. Yet if one objective drew the population to insurgent leaders, it was the hope of breaking the cycles of desire and disenchantment to which Cuban history had for so long appeared condemned. 60 years later, and despite all the water under the bridge, the myth of subjunctive possibility for many Cubans, the now finally of the Cuban historical imagination, remains unfulfilled. Ostensibly, both diehard revolutionaries and disillusioned emigres still want nothing more than to leave the past behind, whether to finally achieve socialism's utopia of equitable development and human solidarity, or to bring about the supposed panacea of the Cuban Revolution's demise. Neither, it seems to me, is particularly close to fulfilling their goal. Today, one must admit that the possibilities of reaching anything like common ground seem remote. The Cuban retrospective field is full of paradox, overlapping nostalgias, and more thoughtful reflections about the past than in the past. Those who experienced the beginning stages of the Cuban conflict are aging and rapidly disappearing. Yet biology provides little consolation as memory polarizations of old are recycled in fresh public echo chambers. I do not want to remember, says the main character of the novel Memorias de su Desarrollo from 1968, which became a famous Cuban film that same year. I do not want to have inconsolable memories. For now, and maybe for the foreseeable future, Cubans appear to have little choice. And if you'll indulge me for just one more minute, I just want to end on a personal note. Speaking of memory, 2020, the year in which I completed this book, has obviously been a year that we all will remember for many reasons, but certainly as a year of collective tragedy, a tragedy which obviously extends into this year as well, as the pandemic continues. I was touched personally by that tragedy a few weeks ago when I lost my grandfather to COVID-19, or at least we think. With him died not the last living memory of Cuba in my immediate family, because my dad's memory of his childhood remains remarkably clear, but certainly the last living memory of the members of my family who really lived adult lives there, as we lost my grandmother a number of years prior. So I have been reflecting on the memory of my grandparents and what this loss means for my own sense of Cuban American identity, my understanding of Cuba, and the work that I do, which they no doubt helped inspire, even if they didn't realize it. And I have to say, I've become very grateful for a choice that they did not make. Unlike perhaps other Cuban exiles of their generation, they did not seek to sort of constantly share, let alone impose, their memories of Cuba and its revolution on me. In fact, growing up, I rarely remember them talking, let alone waxing nostalgic about Cuba at all. Perhaps that's a reflection of a kind of don't look back, look forward attitude that they seem to have embraced when they made the decision to leave the United States in 1962, my grandmother especially. But I suspect it's also a reflection of the fact that it was too painful for them to look back, at least with me. Regardless, I'm grateful, and here I'm embarrassing myself by showing kitty pictures. I'm grateful because in not trying too hard to pass on some kind of a torch, they did in another way. They inadvertently freed me to think through Cuba's history and Cuba's memory wars, as I hope I have in this book, comprehensively from somewhat of a constructive distance, but also at the same time assuming them profoundly as my own. And so I just want to dedicate this talk to their memory. And I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mike, for your very insightful, synthetic, and at the end, very touching presentation. I remind you all who are attending that you can submit your questions through the button at the bottom of your screen that says Ask a Question, and I will try to raise them for our guest author in the next few minutes. But in order to get this conversation started, I have a few questions of my own. So let me just begin by asking you what I think is a pretty simple question, but it might get complicated. What do you mean by retrospective politics, Mike?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. You know, there was a section on theory in this talk that I decided to scrub for the sake of time and the audience's attention span, perhaps. But yeah, you know, the term retrospective politics, I landed on it after really wrestling with the meaning of the terms memory and history. You know, what's the distinction between them? What's the relationship between them? And scholars and theorists have approached those questions from all kinds of perspectives, arriving at all kinds of different conclusions. And when we think about sort of the value of memory and history, or memory versus history, in sort of arriving at some kind of truth, there's different perspectives on this. For some, memory is entirely too subjective, right? And it can be flawed in that way, insofar as we're talking about personal memory, right? Whereas history, the scholarly work of the historian, is at least to try to aspire to some kind of objectivity by combining perspectives and sources and things like that, right? For others, though, and this is not an either or, I think both things can be true. History can often be suspect insofar as sort of history, the work of historians, can be kind of linked to a project of official history in one political context or another. And therefore memory becomes sort of the reservoir of the real life experiences that are kind of left out of the story. So as I said, you know, I think there's truth on to both of those arguments. But one thing that the terms memory and history both do is they treat their subjects as kind of static. And I was interested more really following along the work of a historical sociologist named Jeffrey Olick, in thinking about sort of memory processes, or the politics of historical memory as always active, as always in motion, as about sort of constantly making claims on the shape of national memory, or the memory or history of a different kind of collectivity. So retrospective politics is a term that attempts to get at that, right? That I'm not less interested in this book, as I said, in kind of, you know, doing side-by-side analysis of two monuments, and one represents history this way, one represents the other. I'm more interested in Cubans arguing with themselves in the press, and following arguments over a series of months as they're coming to terms with sort of where the revolution has come from, or where it's going. So that's the idea, right? Trying to capture, in some sense, how Cubans are how the past is part of the present that people are living actively all the time. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, of course, it's not a simple question. So I see some questions coming in. So before we turn to them, I wanted to ask you a couple of other things. In your presentations, as well as in your book, you really combine very creatively different kinds of sources. And of course, the more traditional sources are the journalistic articles and some of the printed. But I thought it was fascinating to the way you use films and Que Pasa USA, a TV program, letters, cartoons, and then that chapter on all histories. So my question is, how do you combine these sources? How do you weigh them? And you know, what is the purpose of doing this sort of multimedia kind of analysis?
Yeah, thanks. You know, I wish I could say there was a master plan in terms of you know, which sources I would go to, and you know, for different topics or pieces of this story. really the selection of sources kind of emerged organically, if I can use that word, from me trying to sort of fill in gaps where perhaps more traditional source bases weren't available, right? I think the chapter on the 1970s in Cuba is a good example. It's a chapter in which I sort of argue that on the one hand, the 70s is this period where Cuban socialism achieves a certain amount of stability, quote unquote. There's a process of institutionalization. The economic situation improves relative to the 1960s because of increased Soviet aid. But it's also this moment in which sort of, if you spend some time looking at the cultural landscape, looking at state media, but looking at film coming out of ICAIC, et cetera, it's as if all of the sort of high points of the revolution have come and gone. Right, the high points that have been celebrated. Like what is actively sort of at stake? Very little, it seems to me, in the cultural production. When you think about kind of the anniversaries that are still celebrated in sort of Cuba's official memory calendar to this day, the vast majority of them are from the early 1960s, or they're kind of classic dates from Cuba's independence wars, et cetera. Very little about the 1970s seems sort of memorable to the state. And so I was interested in getting at that. And given that you can't exactly go to the Cuban archives and find, ready evidence of sort of how citizens and how young people in particular, new generation that's coming of age, are existing in relationship to this sort of meta narrative at the state that they see everywhere, I found that culture was an important kind of way around that, or a way to try to get at some of that anxiety or those complications. And I found, on the one hand, plenty of examples of a kind of audiovisual culture of almost treating the revolution as sort of consummated history that's become a spectacle that you can relive from the comfort of the present. And there I highlight this famous TV show called En Silencio Ha Tenido Que Ser, which is like a mini series. But it's also a moment where, in a film like One Day in November by Humberto Solás, which was a film that was shelved and practically censored for many years, and this is precisely the reason, because it is a more introspective take on a guy who has been a loyal revolutionary his whole life, wakes up one day, goes to a doctor, is told that he has an aneurysm that's ready to burst at any moment, and he can never work again. And so this sends him sort of spinning to reflect upon his trajectory and seeing people around him who don't appreciate the things that he had to go through. And so it's this very interesting, within Cuban audiovisual culture of the time, it's this very interesting kind of introspective take. And so cultural text there became, in some ways, a way around our archival limitations, particularly on the island side. And then with respect to oral history, I'll just say briefly, one of the other kind of methodological challenges that I faced was, where would oral history be potentially in this book? I mentioned the challenge of trying to get at bottom-up perspectives. And one would think that, okay, I'll just go interview people, right? The challenge is, if I'm interested in understanding how people understood Cuba's past or their own past 40 years ago, if I interview them now, what they share with me is as much a reflection of the Cuban memory war since. Very difficult to get at that, that precise thing that I'm trying to get at. So, I shy away from oral history for a large degree, with the exception of the final chapter, which deals with these return visits. And there I found I never make the oral history the subject of the research, but it was important to get the stories of this experience itself, right? And so, that in a sense is a little bit about the combination of sources.
Okay. My final question before we turn into the audience is what you ended on with, although I wasn't sure where you were going with that, but I wanted to ask you about your own personal positioning within the narrative as a second generation, or perhaps 2.5 generation, I'm not sure how you describe yourself, Cuban American. And although you do provide some glimpses here and there, most of the time you kind of stay away from, from the story itself. So I think at the end, you do present some personal reflections on what this whole thing means to you, right? And of course, you're not an objective standby person, right? You are part of the story.
Yeah. I'm a historian, not an anthropologist or ethnographer. So, perhaps I should have taken a bit more of a cue from some of the excellent kind of autoethnography work in your field to dedicate a bit more time to that, because there's certainly a way in which I'm connected to the story, albeit, a couple degrees removed, and in a way that I think I went into this knowing how expansive a subject it would be because of that connection, frankly, fearful of whether I could do it justice. Understanding that from the get-go, I was going to have to acknowledge that, you know, one monograph can't cover everything. I remember going to Cuba and telling a close friend what I was doing research on, and he responded to me, "Bueno, eso es un temazo," right? That's a huge theme, like kind of, you know, doubting, right? So, but I suppose because I think I said it hopefully a little bit at the end of my remarks tonight. I think because of the both sort of connection and distance I have from the place, my kind of insider outsider relationship to Cuba itself, where I go and I don't feel like you know, un turista cualquiera, right? But I am also clearly marked by my foreign status. I think that freed me to be a bit sort of independent from the constraints of memory narratives with which I had grown up, because frankly, I didn't grow up with them everywhere, right? And so I went into this thinking about Cuban history as plural, and the memory wars of being composed of plural stories. And as soon as I started to see that, you know, yes, there is this bilateral sort of fight between the official history of the revolution and the kind of counter history that's preserved, argued for in the exile community, but it's much more complicated than that. Within the revolution, there's all kinds of fractures and debates within the exile fold too, and you had to understand all of these things and also understand their relationship to one another. So I would like to think that my subjectivity set me up to tackle the story in that way, and perhaps in a way that I hope is novel and insightful.
Great. And in many ways, I just wanted to add that your writing and the way you set up the chapters going back and forth between Havana and Miami since the 1959 revolution is precisely what you've been doing yourself by traveling back and forth between the two places. Yeah. So let's turn to some of the questions. We have 17 questions so far, or comments at least. We'll try to raise as many of them as possible. One of them is from Anna. I can't tell the last name. You may know her or perhaps not. And she wants to know, would you write a part 2 from 1979 to now?
I haven't set out to do that just yet, but it does need to be done, certainly. Yeah, you know, another story, when I set out to write, I should say this book began as a dissertation, and I took a look at my dissertation proposal from way back when, and I set out, my goal was to do it all, right? Was 1959 to the present, or at least through the 1990s. And you know, once I got in the field, I realized that was just far too. I I'd bitten off more than I could chew, right? So I certainly think there's room for that. Whether that's the next thing I do, I'm not sure. I think it is important for some distance to pass between the now in which one is writing and the period of time that one is researching. Already writing history about the 60s and 70s feels like very recent history. So perhaps the moment is not yet ripe to see the 1980s, the 1990s with sufficient critical distance or with sufficient availability of sources, frankly. But one day I hope someone does if it's not me.
Great. Jean Rosenberg, our colleague from FIU, wants to know if you anticipate if your book will have a readership on the island.
I mean, I hope so. It's funny. I messaged a friend the other day saying, "Hey, I want to get a copy of your book," and maybe I shouldn't say this either, but he said, "No, I already have it." Right. So let's just say that the Cubans are very adept at the internet and that formal and informal ways of circulating information, books, TV, etc. So at least one friend has confirmed that it's there. Perhaps it's going from flash drive to flash drive. I mean, you know, one thing that I echoing something I said, one limitation is that this is a book in English, which I as an academic working in the United States, you know, I had to write in English. But you know, this is a story that hopefully can be told in Spanish too. So if there are any translators out there listening, you know, call me.
So I think this is the first time that a book is available on a paquete before it's actually translated into Spanish. Anyway, moving on to other questions. I think Kimberly Ramirez is asking, based on your table of contents, if you address the differences among various groups of people like Marialitos and Pedro Panes and other waves of Cuban exiles in your book.
not those, because of course the main part of the book ends in 1979, and there's, again, in the conclusion I do cover briefly some of the history of Mariel and some of the tension, frankly, the ties of both solidarity but also suspicion that characterize the relationship between the Cuban community that was here prior to Mariel and those who came in Mariel. But I do that in a brief way. But I do highlight different differences and tensions within the Cuban exile community along the way. One of the things that I highlight that I think is a interesting story that, frankly, I'd be interested in researching more about is we tend often to think about the sort of Cuban migration in the 1960s as that all of that is perhaps, it's sometimes called el exilio histórico, right, or el exilio. But there's an important break between October 1962, when the flights out are stopped in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 1965 on, when the freedom flights begin after the Camarillo boat lift. And what's very interesting is that in the records that I was able to consult from some of the organizations in the Cuban community in Miami, there's even corners of suspicion on the part of some of those who had come earlier, vis-a-vis toward some of the newer Cuban migrants who are coming post 1965. They are, still relative to the Cuban population as a whole, they tend to be more sort of middle class, but they are less sort of predominantly professional and upper middle class than that first wave. They're more working class. It's a lot of people who had their very small businesses nationalized in 1968, for example, more people from rural parts of the country. So there are some differences there that I think, and even tensions that have been a little bit kind of gone underground in our own narratives of how we tell the Cuban diaspora story. So that's one area where I think the questioner might find some interesting material for reflection on those kinds of issues.
Here's an interesting question by Elizabeth Carrillo, who is interested in your comments about language, the languages of this memory war, and then she refers specifically, for instance, to phrases like Playa Girón as opposed to Bay of Pigs, or bloqueo versus embargo. So can you comment on that issue, on the language that you found in these representations of Cuba and exile?
Yeah, it's a very astute observation. Language is not a neutral participant in the Cuban memory wars. I would also add there, do you say Fidel or do you say Castro, or do you not even say anything? Do you use some other kind of gesture or some other kind of word? So it's posed a kind of writing challenge for me, because I am trying to tell the history of these memory wars in the terms in which they were fought. At the same time, as a writer, you want to have sort of standardized language to not sort of confuse the reader, perhaps. So what I tried to do, to the best of my ability, was use terms as they would have been used in particular contexts, and to the best of my ability, have my narrative reflect the ways that those terms would have been used by the historical actors that I'm writing about in a different chapter. That isn't always possible. I mean, one major thing there is, this idea of the revolution as the revolution, right? That is many might object to that description, period, as a way to characterize what happened. That was a term that I felt was kind of unavoidable to use in the capital R way, even as the revolution sort of gets personified as an actor in ways that I think are problematic and need to be deconstructed, and in ways that hopefully I do a bit of in the book. But there, at the end of my introduction, I have literally a note on terminology that's about some of this stuff. Not all the examples, but yeah, a Girón versus Bay of Pigs, I think, is a good example. The Pedro Pan one, there is a long history of memory wars over Operation Pedro Pan. That is one sort of piece of the memory wars that I deliberately left out of this book, because there's an excellent article by Anita Casavantes Bradford that does just that. So I didn't want to cover that ground. But that's an interesting example, because Pedro Pan is known as Pedro Pan in Spanish in el exilio, whereas it's known as Operación Peter Pan on the island. So it's interesting how the language there has been kind of inverted for reasons that, frankly, are not entirely clear to me. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah. So a question from Julio Sabater, who notes that his impression is that the new generations in Cuba are not engaged or interested in these memory wars, and wants to know, what is your assessment?
I think it's I disagree in part. Certainly, I think frankly there are Cubans of all generations and ages who are too focused on the day to day and too fed up with hearing about history constantly. They don't want to hear about it. That's in fact part of the story of the Cuban Memory Wars that I relay in the conclusion. But I think there are really interesting examples of young Cubans who have been very engaged in, particularly young Cubans who are working in arts and culture, in revisiting certain episodes, particularly from the revolution's history. And I would point to a couple examples. Maybe some of the audience members will know that in 1964 there was this case that became infamous in Cuba about sort of a guy who had been a member of one revolutionary organization. And forgive me, perhaps it's just because it's the evening. I'm blanking on the case. The caso Marquitos, Marcos Rodriguez. Long story short, he was accused of basically working secretly for the Cuban Communist Party, the old guard Cuban Communist Party, and ratting out other revolutionaries at a time when in the 1950s, the old Cuban Communist Party didn't agree with the insurrectional strategy against Fulgencio Batista. And this major polemic comes out in 1964. There's a court case. The point is that a really interesting young filmmaker named Rosario Sanchez Parodi a few years ago made a wonderful documentary about this case, interviewing all of the key players, right? Going back to this episode in the Cuban Memory Wars that had since sort of been forgotten. And she's, my age or younger. I would point to the controversy within the past year at the Cuban Young Creators Film Festival about a documentary called Sueños al Pairo, which is about the Maria Boatlift, among other things, made by two young filmmakers who rescued archival footage from Icaic to make a very critical portrait of the Maria Boatlift and how it affected one Cuban musician in particular, right? The film's existence prompted a kind of localized iteration of a memory war, right? When it was censored, and then when other young Cuban filmmakers in solidarity agreed to remove their own films from the festival to protest this act of censorship. So I find that there's a good deal of interest. At the same time that there are a lot of folks who want to focus on the here and now. It's a mixed bag, I think, in that respect. But I wouldn't say that the Cuban Memory Wars are irrelevant entirely for a younger generation.
Okay, comment from Ada Ortuzar Young, who asked the question: how does your book differ from other historians who don't have a personal connection to the Cuban community on both sides of the Straits of Florida?
I don't know. There are a lot of books on Cuban history by folks who do have a personal connection to the Cuban story one way or another. One of the things that I find so rich about the history of Cuban studies as a discipline is precisely that, the role of the Cuban diaspora in the discipline, not just as a topic of study, but as protagonists of that research and really some of the foundational figures of the field. So I think, frankly, that for a lot of us, there's a personal connection. And one thing that I note too is that a lot of folks who come to Cuban historical research who perhaps don't have a personal connection, it becomes personal very quickly, right? Which doesn't mean to say that their positionality is not distinct or complicated in different ways. But I don't know as if I can establish a clear distinction. There are excellent scholars of non-Cuban descent who do excellent work on Cuba. That perhaps their complete outsider perspective shapes their point of view in ways that are interesting and productive. Just as I think some degree of closeness to the subject can also be constructive and salutary. So that's my diplomatic way of answering the question.
Okay, good job. Hector Manuel Gutierrez wants to know if you perceive any differences between the new immigrants who were born during the 1970s and the one who were already integrated into the revolutionary process during the 1960s.
Well, I think, and I could extend that question, Cubans born in the 80s, the 90s, right? Generation is kind of one, of course, generation is this concept that's very hard to define. When does one generation start? When does one generation end? But I certainly think that there are kind of generational cohorts, folks who have experiences that they've kind of come up with that are important to their own understanding of their lives and their own relationship to, again, these kind of meta narratives, whether it's the Cuban Revolutionary State or the Cuban diaspora in general. One of the differences that I would note, less perhaps in regards to the difference between the 60s and 70s, but more broadly, is plural forms of nostalgia. Nostalgia is very natural for human beings. Nostalgia can exist in various different registers, a sort of more strictly celebratory register or kind of a more critical, reflective mode. But what's interesting is I think when we think about Cubans and nostalgia, perhaps our mind immediately instinctually goes to Cubans who left, like my grandparents, frankly, in the 1960s, and you think of kind of lamenting La Cuba de ayer, right? And yet, one of the things I found in the course of this research is that nostalgia is a many-headed hydra that appears in multiple places and at multiple times and among multiple generational voices. The 1970s is an interesting example on the island, going back to some of those cultural texts I was referencing, because one finds in a certain cultural production or even political speech, a way in which young Cubans who were not around to be kind of the protagonists of the early revolutionary transformations are made to almost feel guilty that they weren't, and sort of therefore eternally indebted to an older generation, right? And that's a move that Cuban artists and culture workers would later contest. I think of in the late 80s, early 90s, a singer like Carlos Varela, his famous song Guillermo Tell, in which, playing on the overture of William Tell, he basically says to the father, and now it's your turn to put the apple on your head, and let me try to shoot the apple off your head, right? This is a generational call to, you've called the shots, you've determined the history that we have inherited. It's time for us to have our own voice, right? But also the ways that Cubans can be nostalgic for different periods of time. I've even, and it may seem shocking, I read a piece within the last couple of years of someone sort of waxing nostalgic about certain human solidarities that they missed in the Cuba of today that they remembered from the special period, a time of great economic need, obviously. So I think that would be my answer. There's no sort of one difference that I would note, but the many manifestations of nostalgia, I think, is just a fascinating subject.
Okay, here's what I think is a big question from Nick Ramos. And he says that you touch on the big theme of the book being a constant struggle between how to interpret the island's history and what is the proper way to remember it. Are there any interesting conclusions, he asks, you came to regarding this push and pull?
That's a great question, Nick. And hi, Nick. Nick has a great podcast, so everyone check it out. I don't know as if I've come to any great conclusions about that push and pull, except to note that the history of that push and pull is really important and really complicated and goes beyond, as I said at the beginning, this kind of image of just two sides, two versions sort of arguing with one another. I think you're right. There is this interesting dynamic. And frankly, now I'm wishing I had actually sort of put it this way in the introduction or something, between battles over interpreting the past and then battles over how to represent that or how to remember that. I mean, at the end, I think all these things are deeply intertwined. And I would just highlight, the complexity of those struggles. How the Cuban press in 1959 is so fascinating because it's a press that is still, there are revolutionary newspapers that are associated with different revolutionary organizations and factions. There's the private press from the quote unquote old Cuba that still exists. They're in alignment at one moment about what the revolution is, and they're fighting with one another, and they're all fighting about the legacies of like who did what, when, and why, and who's the biggest hypocrite for claiming to speak in the name of the revolution. And those things I think are really interesting and important. It might be easy to dismiss them as just factionalism or just personal politics, but it's more than that, because these are arguments that deeply mattered, and one has the sense also that they matter to readers. So I guess, Nick, that's my way of dodging your question. It's a good question. I'm gonna keep thinking about it.
So Daniel Jimenez wants to thank you for the discussion and offers his condolences for your loss. And he wants to know, is there a memory from your research that you would like to see held on to and brought to life by Cubans and Cuban Americans today?
Memory from my research, does that mean memory from my time doing the research, or something that I sort of substantially I've got out of the research? Maybe I'll take both. I have many positive memories from my own process of doing the research, both in the United States, here in South Florida, and in Cuba. I really treasure the relationships that I forged in Havana, which have become, some of my closest friendships to this day. And those friends are, as tends to happen, and as I note in the acknowledgments of the book, many of those friends are no longer in Cuba. Some still are. So dissimilar experiences from, visiting a friend's hometown. Shout out to Madruga on the outskirts of Havana, and spending a weekend with his family, playing dominoes. Those things I will always treasure. In terms of a kind of a memory from the research, gosh, hard to pick one. I guess I'll say something, thinking of an audience. I mean, we are virtually in Miami, right? And I suspect that there may be others in the audience who are Cuban American. I just invite all Cuban Americans to go back to the Cuban Exile Press in the early 1960s, and to visit FIU libraries, to visit the CHC at the University of Miami, spend some time in those periodicals, and one will realize that Cuban exiles have never only told one story about their country or their past, and they've never been entirely in agreement with one another, and that's okay. That's democratic, right? So those debates in the early exile press, the debates between, frankly, folks who had been more pro-Batista, those who had been against Batista, the kind of arguments between them, the attempts to forge alliances when those alliances break down. I think that's a really important part of the political history of the Cuban diaspora that gets overlooked under the mantle of sort of a more unitary story. And I think it's important to recover that, to remember that.
Can you say something about the role of Jose Miro Cardona, who I know you looked at the papers at the Cuban Heritage Collection, and you devote some pages to him. What was his role in the 1960s?
Sure. Jose Miro Cardona became, because his papers are available and so rich, a sort of a window to get at broader dynamics. And then there are the dynamics that I was just describing, sort of factional politics in the exile community. So Miro Cardona is a well-known lawyer, had been head, if my memory is right, I mean, I know it's in the book, the head of the Havana Bar Association. He had defended a number of folks who had been involved in anti-Batista activities in one way or another. And he is named the first prime minister of the Cuban revolutionary government when it takes power in January 1959. So as such, he is he's prime minister before Fidel Castro is prime minister. He's not prime minister for long, for a month or so, but he's prime minister when the revolutionary tribunals of the very beginning moments of the revolution are taking place. He, like others of his kind of more sort of moderate line of political thinking, begins to distance himself from the direction that the revolution is taking. After Fidel takes his place as prime minister, he spends some time as Cuba's ambassador to Spain. He's then recalled, and he eventually seeks asylum in the embassy of Argentina, I believe, and then from there makes his way, we think, with a certain amount of assistance from the Central Intelligence Agency, to South Florida. And in South Florida, he would become the leader of this early exile organization called the Cuban Revolutionary Council, which was meant to sort of be this umbrella political front that was the political leadership in principle behind the Bay of Pigs invasion, although the history is messier than that. And so Miro Cardona is really interesting because he is somebody who defends initially very strongly this idea that the revolution was necessary, that there were not just political problems with the Batista government, but social and economic ills that needed fixing, but that it was betrayed to a form that it should never have been. And so when it's kind of no mistake that he becomes a leader in the Cuban exile community, because that narrative also matches what Washington, D.C. is trying to do politically in this moment, which is to support Cuban exiles who don't have ties to the Batista government. However, for others, Miro Cardona is a problematic figure precisely because he had been part of the revolutionary movement and government early on. And so his leadership is contested from the start. And what I trace in the section of the chapter that I devote to him is also an evolution in his thinking, from a very strong defender of kind of this idea that a revolution was necessary, and if not radical, it was certainly meant to be socially progressive, economically progressive, to kind of moving toward hallmarks of a more conservative narrative, whereby he's arguing essentially by the mid to late 60s that Cuba didn't really need much social change. And so it's a really interesting evolution that he undergoes that I think provides a window into some of the exile communities' memory politics in that early period.
And also, if I remember correctly, you argue that he was one of the main proponents of the narrative of the betrayed revolution. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not him alone, certainly, but him among others.
Now, we have a couple of interesting comments and questions by two colleagues, Eliana Rivero and Alejandro Andreos. Let me read part of Eliana's comment, who thanks you first for your wonderful presentation.
Hola, Eliana.
I guess the key question that she asks is that she feels different from the typical Miami exile mentality. And she's lived outside of Dade County for more than half a century. She lives in Arizona, for those of you who don't know her. And she's visited Cuba several times between 79 and 2016. So would you interpret her experience in terms of her distance from Miami and also, of course, her own academic work related to yours and others who have studied the Cuban community?
Would I interpret it in a certain way, or how would I interpret it? Is that the question?
Well, she says that she doesn't feel part of Miami, and then she wants to, I guess, get your opinion on why that feeling.
You know, I think Miami is a generous place that welcomes all of its citizens, past and present. No, you know, this book is not either just about Havana versus Miami. You know, a lot of the source material from the exile side of the story comes from Miami, means no surprising, but there's a middle chapter that deals with Cuban exile youth organizations in the 70s, some of which were more active in New York, New Jersey area, which of course is another site of Cuban diaspora settlement. So I think that, you know, all Cubans are part of the story of the Cuban memory wars. I mean, wherever they have settled, I have a feeling that, you know, Eliana, these are stories that have traveled with you and debates. Eliana, I should say, was generous enough to be interviewed for the book about her return trip, her first return trip to Cuba, including in 1979, in which I just will say this as an aside because it's a very, very beautiful phrase. She described what it was like to go back to Cuba as an exile after so many years and reunite with one's family. And she talked about what she called velorios al revés, wakes in reverse, which was sort of what it was like to arrive and then, you know, stay up all night speaking with family member, kind of sharing everything that everybody had missed, right? And that's just a very beautiful phrase. So, Eliana, for that and other reasons, you may not be part of a typical Miami experience. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but I think you're part of the story and you're in the book. So therefore you are.
Turning to another comment by Alejandro Andreos, is an art critic. He also find the book truly profound, he says, because you managed to reveal the paradoxes of these memories and achieve an inviolable balance. And he particularly likes the use of visual material. So here's kind of a question related to a previous one you answered, which is, do you think you were able to achieve this balance because you were born here and that gave you the needed distance from both el exilio histórico and the island?
I don't know. I mean, saludos, Alejandro. It's good to be with you in this format. I don't know. You know, I suppose I'll leave it up to my readers to psychoanalyze me. Yeah, I mean, I do think generational perspective is different. You know, maybe I shouldn't say this either, unless my FIU students hear me. But I didn't grow up in the 305. You know, I too grew up outside of South Florida. I grew up in South Florida, but not in Miami. So I think that, you know, there's a kind of outsider-insider perspective there that perhaps helped, but you know, I think can also be limiting too. I mean, there are experiences that I am approaching from the point of view of not an eyewitness, and that brings challenges. That brings needing to earn trust that people who want to entrust your stories, who you want to entrust their stories to you, see in you a viable interlocutor. So I think certainly parts of my background facilitate that, but I'm also somebody, you know, who's gotten quite used to the ¿Y tú de dónde eres? Like this kind of question, right? And you, where are you from? You know, both in La Habana and Miami, right? Everybody wants to know sort of what my backstory is. So I've got my backstory down to a pat, and I think that helps. But Alejandro, again, I'm sorry to kind of dodge the question, but I mean, I suppose so in parts. My background helped here, but I'd like to think that this work is possible really for anybody to do. I'm not special.
Kelly Urban, also congratulations on your wonderful presentation. And she wants to know about the difficulty of tracking personal beliefs. And you mentioned that it was easier to do so here in Miami than in Cuba. So she wants to know if you found any evidence of Cuban exiles who felt differently in private than they felt free to express in public here in Miami.
Interesting question. Yeah, I did. Going back to the figure of Jose Miro Cardona, one of the things that is preserved in his files are just these correspondence records, right? Letters that he got or that other people got and were sent to him. And there you find things that are just really fascinating. And I don't know as if the opinions that are being expressed are necessarily different from what people might have said in public, but they don't comport with more common or standard narratives of Cuban history that were kind of everywhere in the exile community. So I think of this one letter that Miro Cardona gets and that I dedicate some attention to in the book. It's a letter that somebody has written to him from Spain, somebody who has gone out of Cuba by way of Spain. There he has met delegates or representatives of the exile organization that Miro Cardona leads. And he is somebody who basically wants this organization's help to get a visa to be able to come to the United States. And reportedly he claims in the letter that he had worked in government and he had important information to share. And so basically in exchange for the information that he was willing to provide, la causa, he wanted a visa. And so he writes Miro Cardona saying that basically I did this debriefing essentially, and months have passed and I haven't heard anything from your people. And he attributes it all to the fact that he was a member of a union that worked for an oil plant that had been nationalized, the Standard Oil refinery in Cuba. And so he makes this very kind of anti-imperialist, somewhat conspiracy theory laden, but nonetheless interesting anti-imperialist argument that you're sort of abandoning me to my fate because apparently you guys have gotten so far in bed with the Americans that anybody who was even guilty of touching any American interest in Cuba, con el pétalo de una rosa, with the petal of a rose, he says in the letter, apparently is now persona non grata. So he accuses basically the exile leadership of selling out too much to the United States in the interest of a shared anti-communist struggle. And that's a perspective that I think is very interesting and very, I think was more common than we give it credit for. But so things like that popped up. But Kelly, I can't say whether I found an example of someone saying one thing in public and then saying another thing totally different in private. I mean, certainly Miro Cardona himself is a good example of somebody. He said things in private that were not politic, but they didn't necessarily, and they were far more pessimistic in terms of his sense of creating political unity based on a shared understanding of the past among exiles. Things he probably wouldn't have said in public. So yeah, I guess that's an example of differences, and I in that chapter certainly I draw some of that out. Thanks for the question.
So we're running out of time, but I think we have time for a couple of more questions. There are a lot of nice messages that you can check out later in the chat. Congratulations, so forth. But anyway, I found another question here by Lauren Fine, who notes that you mentioned the exclusion of marginalized communities from the narratives, and she wants to know who are the drivers and agents of these narratives, and where do you locate the power to control those stories?
Yeah. Hi, Lauren. Thanks for tuning in. I mean, the drivers of the narratives become, I think, in many respects in Cuba, the Cuban state as it consolidates over the course of 1960 into 1961 especially. But a Cuban state that I would argue insistently is never quite a monolith and is something more than just a puppeteer, where even in official discourse of the state, one can you can find push-pull differences of approach between different state publications and media outlets. You can find the sort of narratives of Cuban state leaders changing over time. So with regard to marginalized narratives and voices, I mean, these are things that it seems to me the Cuban state has turned to strategically at times. Certainly, and there has been some good writing on this. The relationship of the revolution to sort of Black history in Cuba, I think, is a complicated one, to put it mildly. On the one hand, the revolution has a claim of and sets out early on to address a history of racial discrimination. But by 1962, as scholars like Devin Spence Benson and others have argued, the government essentially says that, we've eliminated the structural basis of racism in this country, which is itself a questionable assertion. And so therefore, basically, the racism problem is solved. So Cuba does begin to celebrate Black history in a way that it hadn't been before. One thinks of the moment in the 1970s, especially when Cuban troops are in Angola, and Fidel Castro identifies Cuba as an Afro-Latin nation. It's no mistake that in that era too, Ikaik puts out I think 3 films that are really focused on the history of slavery in Cuba. So there's a kind of linkage of Black history as kind of leading inexorably to this revolution that, among other things, has eliminated racial inequality, at least in that vision. But as historians of race relations in Cuba and anti-racist activists in Cuba today will tell you, the history is much messier than that, right? So that's one example. And conversely, on the exile side, I mean, again, it's not as if the exile community has a state that is sort of in control of the narrative or attempting to be. But I do think that the exile political sphere generates elite voices, particularly in the exile press, that have a preponderant influence over the kinds of stories that are being told. There's a rich multimedia landscape in the exile community too, composed of filmmakers and TV producers and things like that who used to work on the island who are here. Some of whom who are repurposing sort of pro-revolutionary films that they made on the island and then repurposing them into sort of denunciations in exile. So those voices, I think, become preponderant. And just taking the example of race as one entry point here. Certainly it is true that the Cuban migration in the early 1960s did not reflect the racial diversity of the Cuban population insofar as class was tied to race, and most of those leaving Cuba early on were of an more upper class background. The extent to which, you still, I would argue to this day, find a good amount of denialism about whether racism was ever a problem in Cuba's past, right? And so there are moments when this pops up too in the discourse of the exile community over time. It still does, problematically so, I would argue. So I hope that answers the question, Lauren, and thanks for tuning in.
So one final question, which is, I think, in many ways a follow-up from Anasa Hicks, and she wants to know if you found any evidence in the 1970s that Cuba's engagement with Africa, mostly Angola, had to do with the lack of revolutionary movements in that decade. And she comments that sometimes she finds that this barely contained glee in the way that generals and soldiers talk about the opportunities to go to Africa, especially Cubans who were too young to have fought against Batista on the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation, and Asa, thanks. I haven't found that much evidence of it, but in part because the Cuban military intervention in Angola was secret in many ways for a time at the start, and so I have the sense that it is not so present in the public discourse, notwithstanding Fidel Castro calling Cuba an Afro-Latin nation and obviously acknowledging Cuban troops in Angola. But I have a sense that it's not so present in the public discourse as it would be in later years. But there is something about, there's almost like, I think this is a subject worthy of further reflection, almost like a vicariousness, right? That this is our chance, right? To go and fight a front of revolutionary battle that, as you said, Jorge, we were too young to have been able to do on the island. And I would argue that Angola is not the only moment. I think that the triumph of the Sandinista revolution in 1979 is another moment where Cuba is almost kind of like vicariously reliving its own past in a way. And to the extent that Cubans are sent as part of educational missions and healthcare missions and other kinds of things to go to Nicaragua, Cuba assumes a sort of big brother role right there. So I think that's a really interesting observation. Of course, I think the memory politics around Angola themselves are incredibly complicated. And speaking of young Cubans who are interested in the memory wars, I would highlight another film whose name I'm forgetting, but there's a great documentary that was done not too long ago by a young Cuban filmmaker in which she basically went and interviewed a lot of veterans of Angola in rural parts of Cuba and the way in which they feel abandoned and that their histories don't matter and don't count. So I think that's a really rich subject for exploration for sure.
Okay, so we were told at the beginning of the presentation off camera that Cuban and Cuban American topics at Books and Books tend to drag on because, of course, there's a lot to be said. So I want to end here, but before I end, I want to take advantage of a comment by our colleague Maria Carla Chicuen, who, again, congratulations for your excellent presentation. And she notes, like I think many of us would agree, that she was very moved by your tribute to your grandparents. And I am inspired, she says, by the ways your book will help us to gain new understandings of our own Cuban family members. So with that, I think we need to close the meeting. I will ask our hostess, Cristina Nosti, to
This
say
time,
goodbye.
it did not drag. It actually did not drag at all, although it is almost 8:30. But thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. Thank you to all our viewers joining us from everywhere. Remember, you can order a copy of the book below by pressing the green button. There we go, Cuban Memory Wars, available at Books and Books. I thank you very much, Mike, for your work. Thank you, Jorge, for your moderating and for the collaboration. Thank you to the Cuban Heritage Collection at UM. And it's my hope that we'll see each other in person sometime soon.
Definitely.
And continue the conversation.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.